Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming and welcome to the fourth session in our Talking About Contemporary Art lecture series hosted by Dr. Mark Pennings and in conjunction with the exciting 21st Century Art in the First Decade exhibition here at GOMA. And also welcome to those of you joining us via our live webcast through the 21st Century blog. Today's lecture is looking at new globalism in the media sphere and new media art, a significant topic for anyone interested in contemporary art and certainly in relation to the 21st Century exhibition. As we will be recording today's lecture, if you have any questions, I'd like to ask that you come down and speak with Mark at the end of the lecture. And also if I could ask if any mobile phones could please be turned to silent. If you miss anything from today's lecture, or if you would like to view any other sessions in the series, which is running every Saturday until the 2nd of April, you can view each session at the 21st Century blog website, 21cblog.com. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Pennings today.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for turning up, and particularly those people I'm seeing for the fourth time, which is really fantastic. Thanks so much. It's been part of a series, as Fiona pointed out, where I've tried to select certain themes that the 21st century has dealt with and then discuss those in a little more detail. Now, in my last lecture, that was last week, I discussed the idea of participation in art, the idea of a kind of democratic art, which includes a very inclusive kind of approach to making art. And that sort of participatory art, it really posits social relations as the subject of art and is often a very interactive and collaborative kind of approach to making art, which is linked to a sort of broader social context of inclusion. But these works mostly require physical interactions in an actual gallery space. But as we know, the technological revolution of digital media has produced a different conception of participation in our world, especially the web and social media that provide phenomenal capacity for communication in the media sphere, which encourages what one might call virtual participation rather than the physical kind of participation. This lecture is really talking about a virtual participation. Now, I should say as well that much as I've researched this area, I'm not an expert in digital media, but I obviously found a great deal for this lecture, and I hope you find that of interest. So just to start off, I did want to talk about the media sphere, and one could say that perhaps in the year 1500 in Europe, the media sphere consisted of paintings in churches. Probably predominantly that would have been what the media sphere was. In the Industrial Revolution, the media sphere would have consisted of photographs, cinematic forms, telegraph, television, telephones, etc. Yet our understanding of the media sphere today is dependent on the digital revolution. And digital technology reproduces and duplicates images, as we know, on a scale never before seen in human history. And we have, of course, a whole range of kind of apparatuses that convey that sort of stuff, obviously computers and iPhones and iPads and all that sort of thing. But as many of us will know, the really big catalyst in the onset of the digital revolution has been the internet. Even though the web was only launched in 1989, it has very rapidly become a dominant communication form. And the internet use apparently doubles every 100 days. And actually checked the figures for the use of the internet, and apparently in June 2010, it was reported that 6,845,609,690 people were using the internet, or of evidence of internet use, and it was calculated that this represented 28.7% of the world's population, which is a pretty phenomenal kind of figure. Now, the pervasive power of the digital revolution, of course, has been enhanced by Web 2, G3 and the generation of social media, where we see platforms like Facebook, which apparently is currently reaching 500 million users. Excuse me, the screaming voice gives me a chance of a drink. And Facebook reaches 500 million users, and there's a whole host of social media platforms, obviously YouTube, Google Video to Flickr, all of these kinds of things have emerged. And where activities like microblogging, mashups, memes and other new creatures drive and thrive in this sort of environment and contribute to forms of sociality, participation, collaboration and communication that one can describe as virtual relationships in a media sphere. Needless to say, these technologies of the media sphere have led to an expansion of networks of communication, the so-called network culture, which has increased mobility and intensified exchanges of information and intercultural flows, and has also led to development supposedly of a pro rather than a consumer. Apparently a prosumer deals not with artefacts so much, which was, I suppose, characteristic of modern consciousness or the modern consciousness of modernity, but rather with media. Rather than using, objective outcomes of production with media, the prosumer thinks about channels and tools of information processing. That becomes a predominant way of negotiating the world. And further, the prosumer treats artefacts as media, as things to download, rip, remediate and upload in transaction with other users in a perpetually entertaining endeavour. And this milieu is opening up the way for art practices that use multimedia that can move freely across various media and exploit multiple cultural references. So the argument I'm really presenting in this lecture is I'm really talking about aspects of social media, and then I want to throw in art examples during this discussion so to show the way in which it's been developed in certain art practices or in particular artworks. So the media sphere, and what is the media sphere and what is its consciousness? Clearly the technologies are fairly easy to use and have become second nature for generations of people who have grown up with computers and digital technology. I was not one of those people. And their audio-visual literacies are well developed, and activities like sampling, editing and compositing have become a kind of writing. This is one idea that's been proposed, that what it has been developed is a kind of copy, cut, paste logic of substitutions, metaphors, paradigms, etc. And these are based on what digital media theorist Gregory Ulmer has called electricity, E-L-E-C-T-R-O-C-Y, electricity, a kind of literacy of the digital era. And a concept and a way of working, a literacy which prioritises the notion of the remake, the use of found materials. And this is very interesting because as a lecturer, of course, I get, every new generation of students come in and we tell them the same old deal. We tell them the same old deal that, you have to work, you have to create something original, you have to go and do so much research in the library, and there's no clear answers. And usually, increasingly, I'm getting students who look at me as if to say, why are you punishing me? What have I done wrong? Why can't I just press and download and then remix like that, And it's been very interesting to see. It's a very different kind of literacy that has developed. So I've certainly seen that firsthand. So let's talk a little bit about the media sphere and art. The impact on art undoubtedly has been considerable, as in all periods, artistic production is informed by the technologies which are predominant at the time. And it's certainly, the media sphere has certainly affected how artists communicate. And there are, for instance, there's several million artists today that have personal websites. So, that's one example of the way in which the digital revolution has affected artistic production and the way artists sell themselves or make themselves known to other people. The internet, of course, as we all know, has also created huge media databases that contain a massive digital archive that artists are freely exploiting. And social media sites like YouTube and other open source sites have given artists new media forums to show work within the unique formal and media parameters provided by digital multimedia sites. So it's a sort of argument, I suppose, you could make that digital technologies produce the capacity to produce certain, what I would call visual regimes. You know, there might be certain, if you think about like looking at a web page, and we'll see with Ryan Schukarten, he does that very well, he really exploits that. There's going to be a certain saturated hue to the colours that might appear on a computer screen that would not have appeared in an analogue culture. You know, you would not have had those sorts of colours. And so those colours begin to inform the sorts of ways in which artists are working. You might be using a lot of YouTube, and it might be particular editing which is dominant, and then which artists then incorporate and use in their own work. They're just a couple of general examples. And also I think particularly for artists is the idea that this sort of social media creates an attitude, a greater sense of interdisciplinarity, because there's much more access to not only the history of images, but the history of sculpture, the history of design, and all of these things, and history of moving images, which can be manipulated and played with. So I'm saying, and I think the important point to make is it's not as if that wasn't done before with analogue technologies, and in fact, you know, I'm going to show this example of what was Raoul Halsman comes next. You know, this is an artist who's used photo montage, that same sort of mix and match aesthetic or approach to making art. I think what's really critical to understand in our era is that with Halsman is a kind of exceptionalism to what's dominant at the time. I think what we have now is this kind of approach to art is everywhere. It's the fundamental way in which you seek to put images together and the way in which you think. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. I'll give more details about that sort of thing. Now, with Halsman, we've got, as I said, techniques and strategies he employed, like collage and montage, produced by him, who's a member of an early 20th century avant-garde, i.e. the Dada movement. And as I said, that exists today on a completely different scale, a massive scale. A massive scale through remediation techniques like ripping, which apparently is the way you convert audio formats. So you might take a song or something on the web, and then you're able to program it in a way in which you change the kind of type of format that audio is into another kind of delivery system. Things like remixing and mashups, which I'll talk about a bit more now. Now, one artist group called Soda Jerk, which have shown at the Queensland Art Gallery in Goma in the past, they are usually described as kind of intermediate remix artists. So I think maybe a really good example to use is the idea of artists work like DJs, you know, where increasingly, rather than the DJs, you know, who have been around since the late 1970s, you know, where you've got records and you sort of sample a bit here and a sample a bit here on another turntable and you mix them all together, and that's the point. You know, the whole point is the way in which you sample other people's music, and the innovation comes from the way in which you put other sources together in a new way. This is a very dominant kind of way in which artists work today, and of which this group have worked as well. What they do is they cut and paste video, filmic and TV footage into what is called a kind of mashup. So they create from disparate sources, they put it together in a sort of syncretic way or in a new way in order to create a different sort of story, you know, to create a kind of narrative for themselves. They use these sources in order to create their own narratives. In this case, in this work, it was apparently an absurd intergalactic narrative that combined pop culture, Afro-futurist sci-fi myths, and radical racial politics. And so it became a kind of part documentary, part sort of fiction, with a whole lot of archive footage and all sorts of other things put in it. And as I said, in which they created a new narrative from old found material. Clearly, artists do not live in a vacuum, despite myths about, you know, Vincent van Gogh and his friends. They're clearly, you know, today's artists, they are cognizant, they have grown up like any other generation with being used to producing and consuming with online media, and this poses a generational distinction for rethinking the making and reception of contemporary art and culture, as I've already mentioned. And some may be seen as real-time curators who editorialise visual culture. So that's the idea. You get a shift from the idea of the artist having been the original genius, a shift that's kind of become an anachronism towards more the idea of the artist as a creative editor in many ways, a creative manager of visual material. And really, in many respects, many artists are valued today with how sophisticated they are in the deployment and the mixing and matching of those kinds of visual sources. That's a very important thing. It's how sophisticated and intelligent and conceptual they are about the way in which they do those things. And that being the case, it's a kind of what would be called a polyglot approach. It's a kind of very mix and match thing where they do a lot of translations, and in fact where translation becomes the key kind of method. It's not the idea of originality, it's the idea of working and manipulating and becoming sophisticated at translation of different media and cultural forms, translating them, remediating them into different kind of forms. And, Breuning is a good example. He's in this show, and he's well known as a kind of jokester. He does a lot of kind of schoolboy type humour, I suppose you could say, on one level, but it's done in a very sophisticated way. And I think what he represents, a work like this represents, is a sort of attitude that is really dominant. It's about a lot of issues, and I think one of which is about the way in which information and images on the web are kind of circulated and distributed, because the Easter Island bunnies, they're not bunnies, but the Eastern Island figures are very popular icons on the web and have been referred to as memes, and I'll talk a little bit more about what a meme is, M-E-M-E, in a moment. But he's picked up on that, so he's picked up on an internet meme, and then he's also dealing with an era in which it's much easier to get to places like Easter Island. So it's a very, it's kind of one of those places you can get to much easier. So it's also about global tourism. And so it's kind of about a physical global tourism where you can travel much more cheaply to different places. And that's exactly the same kind of attitude that you would have when you're surfing the net. In a way, you're also a kind of tourist of various icons and that, like the Easter Bunny, like the Easter Island figures, and Bugs Bunny. The same sort of thing. They're just two kind of icons in the same system that he puts together. And how does he put them together is interesting. He's combined that sort of idea of the virtual world with the real world, because he actually travelled to Easter Island to do this. Apparently he's set up these ears and all that in the foreground. You can see how they're set up, and then he took the photo to make it look as if they were these statues had the bunny's ears. And of course it's also a very popular thing for tourists to do now, where you'll have a camera which will make someone look like they're patting the head of the Statue of Liberty or something like that. He's drawing on a very sort of common kind of humour which is circulated throughout the world and is associated with tourism. So he's picking up on all of those kinds of contemporary and topical kinds of interests here. And as I said, he's kind of combining the idea of the real and the virtual. And he's doing all of those classic artistic things as well. They also have a very interesting relationship with tradition, because here he's also playing with depth of field. The illusion of field, the illusion of the picture, and by extension the illusion of the picture plane, something which absorbed avant-garde artists for many, many years. If you think about the Cubists and other artists like that, was this fascination with the illusionistic nature of painting and of art, and the way in which that depicted, it gave you the illusion of depth. So he's also kind of working out of a pre-existing tradition at the same time. Now you can see just by that kind of discussion that I've given you, it's incredibly eclectic. That's the first thing. I mean, his sources and what he puts into it just come from all over the place. Now, I did mention memes before, and if you have seen this meme, it is very funny. Basically, what happened, first I'll explain what a meme is. A meme is described as an easily replicated idea or catchphrase or icons or jokes or urban legends from vernacular culture, which kind of related to like a virus. And it's related to a virus because it's a sort of idea which travels remarkably quickly through the virtual community. It gets incredibly popular like this one. Everybody was kind of utilising this kind of meme. And so it's something you catch, it's so popular that it's like a flu that one might catch. And of course what happens if something like this is it's an open source document. So what I mean by that is that someone has put this film on the web and it's in a video file which can be manipulated by other people, and this is how this meme's taken off. So anyway, it's from that movie. I think it was Hugo Gantz as the actor, the German film, which had English subtitles to start with, and it was a scene where he's in the bunker, and it's getting towards the end of the war, and he's still living in dream world, and his generals are all there in front of him, and they start pointing out on the map where he's losing the war, and all the staff are all there behind her watching as these generals are telling Hitler that he's losing the war. And Hitler then flies into a fit of rage, about how everyone's betrayed him, and all of this sort of business. And what someone did is they put that up on YouTube, but they put their own subtitles to it. And everybody started doing it. Everybody started doing their own version of this meme. And you can see here that the subtitle is saying Hitler's now complaining about people memeing him. They changed the original scene. He keeps uploading new parodies that ridicule me and make me look like a complete idiot. So you sort of ended up with, when I actually got this one, it was kind of called, the title of it was The Meme to End All Memes. So it just takes on a life of its own. And every time you get somebody else's material and you put your own spin on it by playing around with the open source material here, then that is the way in which, at least with an amateur community on the web, that creativity is expressed. That is really a much more popular way in which you express your creativity, is through the manipulation of pre-existing material, not through necessarily inventing something completely new yourself. That is the point I suppose I'm trying to make. And as I said, it's a kind of remixing and a mashup, and a mashup is a digital montage, often employing overdubbing or dropping the soundtrack of a film and creating new dialogue or using dialogue from another source, which in effect this is an example of a mashup because you've taken the subtitling away and you've put a different kind of subtitling in. You have manipulated the original filmic scene here. So a film like The Downfall is obviously derived from the digital archive. It's, as I said, was sampled as a digital video file. Millions of digital images also exist online and they can be freely accessed. Many of these come from art museums. These can be selected, reconstructed and edited with tools like Photoshop and Polyvore. And this strategy of generating art and other creative forms from pre-existing images and filmic media has been called post-production by a very hot international curator called Nicolas Bourriaud, who's sort of a curator, started writing a lot of books. And he calls this a culture that does this, and he's talking about artists in this sense. He calls this a culture of post-production, and I'll explain now what he meant by that. When he talked about post-production, he was really trying to describe the way in which contemporary artists are responding to forms of digital knowledge. And the way in which these artists situate their art within a continuum of reproduction and pre-existing works. Right, now, what is meant by that? The traditional idea of the artist is, they're having a bath and they have this brilliant idea that no one else has ever thought about, and they jump out of the bath and they paint the work. It's sold at Sotheby's for $5 million and everyone walks around and says, "You really are a genius, Picasso." That's the kind of classic idea. But really what Bourriaud's talking about is the sort of artists today, what they do, they don't sit in the bath kind of thinking of the eureka moment. They're actually online all the time, already looking at what other people are doing, working with that material, producing something and knowing that material is going to be again maybe manipulated or produced by someone else. So it's as if artists, rather than producing that unique, autonomous, original object, artists now work in an area in which there's just continual creative production within the digital archive and other digital forums. They kind of like become another node in a kind of network of creative production. Yes, and sometimes they pull that work out and they show it here, like with Ryan Trecartin, but predominantly it's the attitude towards the making which Buriaux calls post-production, which he's trying to explain. And what he means there is post, not in the sense in which post is after production. Rather, what he means by post, as I've sort of already indicated, is that it's a zone of activity. The post-production is a zone of activity which is tertiary, right? Not secondary, but tertiary. And where artists are specialised workers of cultural reappropriation. So their skills get honed and refined through cultural reappropriation. And so he goes further, he says something like that what artists do now, more so than anything else, is they invent protocols of use for all existing modes of representation and all formal structures. It is a matter of seizing all the codes of the culture, all the forms of everyday life, and making them function. So as I said, that kind of idea moves away from the idea of autonomous art. And also the idea, which I think Buriaux puts very well, is artists really today, rather than asking rather than asking what can I make that is new, which I really mentioned, which I furnished with the example of the artist in the bathtub, Buriaux says artists really ask much more questions like, how can we make do with what we have? You know, rather than making something new, what can I do with what is already there to remake, to, reappropriate in some kind of way? So in this new context, the artist, as I've been, furnishing you with all of these ideas, the artist reinterprets and reproduces ideas within established networks of cultural products or production. And online image making with its databases, archives and openness to remixability. This is the whole concept. So this is why you're going to get work. I mean, even if it's not directly off the web, what I'm really describing now and what Buriaux is trying to describe with his idea of the post-production is really an artistic sensibility of the digital era. That, this is the kind of idea. And this artist, Martin Arnold there, what he did, this is a good example of remixing, right? He got the 1941 horror film about the Invisible Man, right? He used that film, and then he de-animated the actors. He gradually eliminated the actors from all of the scenes so that the normal idea of narrative loses its coherence because the characters in the story are not there, they're not talking, they're not doing anything. So in this case, really what he's doing is he's working on, his subject is narrative. It's narrative and it's reworking, it's re-articulating an older narrative to suggest a different kind of narrative. And that narrative, what you have after he de-animates and takes everything away, is you end up with the backgrounds with erratic kind of camera movements because the camera movements are originally following the characters, but the characters aren't there anymore. So then you sort of get, exercises or illustrations of maybe, the way cameras moved in Hollywood or British film in the early 1940s. So you begin to see the formalisms of cinematic conventions. You begin to identify cinematic conventions. So that becomes the kind of topic. You can see how it's very conceptual. And also, there might be kind of ghostly changes in the room and sort of various lights and shadows. And they, in themselves, even though he's largely de-animated that, there are kind of traces that are left. So for Buriaux, even though he doesn't mention this particular example, for him, artists interpret, reproduce, re-exhibit, or use works made by others for their use. And it's a culture not of original creativity, but one of transplanting, grafting, and decontextualisation, where creativity involves, selecting cultural objects and inserting them into new contexts. Now, in this way, contemporary art can be quite difficult to manage or to understand because this is the very strong conceptual element of the film. I think, or of a lot of art, because you may be looking at a lot of art today and you're thinking, well, this narrative isn't making sense, or this doesn't seem to be apparently to make sense, because I'm looking at those characters that don't seem to be doing something which is making ordinary sense. And that's often because the focus of the artist's work is not on the characters, it's on some other aspect of the creation of the creative work. as I think this example kind of shows. It's only once you start realising that, it might be about various forms of camera work or whatever that, is in fact the subject of the work, and then you begin to understand perhaps its intellectual aspects. And of course artists have done a whole lot of things. I mean, you would have seen Candice Bright's work upstairs, but this is another work that she did earlier called Mother, and it's just the way in which artists are kind of using this kind of decontextualising and recontextualising ideas in their work. What Brights did in this work, this is Mother, but she also did, the other work, another work which was called Father. And what she did was she just, appropriated, obviously through digital technology, segments from Hollywood films which showed all these famous actresses playing the roles of a mother. And then she, of course, used the images and then put them against backgrounds, right? So she's completely recontextualised the images in this case. Then she also had the same set of list of fathers, and then on one wall of the gallery space she had these women, and on the other, facing them on the other wall was a whole lot of men. And they were projected on the plasma screens. And what happened was she had a lot of fragments. So she would just take various statements that these actresses had made in movies. Statements which were probably stereotypically maternal, which, Hollywood is the great formula factory. So she's picked up on the kind of formulaic aspects of maternity, or the expression of maternity in Hollywood. So that's the subject, are those sorts of stereotypes. And then she's put them all together like this, so that when you do hear these women speak, it's not in a linear kind of narrative. So again, she's kind of playing with the narrative, and she makes it very fragmented. Also, these women are saying certain things, and the men on the other wall are saying certain things back to them, but it's not really making any sense. So it's almost as if what she's trying to suggest is some kind of a fragmentary notion of communication in contemporary culture, I suppose, is a broad way of trying to understand that sort of thing. It's also kind of sampling, like in a hip-hop track as well. There's that kind of idea happening here. And so we have the idea, what she's doing, Buriot describes as a kind of semionauts. Semio, that's S-E-M-I-O-N-A-U-T-S, which is a kind of, it's a conjunction between semiotics, which is the study of signs, and also naut, as in astronaut. So he's combining this idea that artists are kind of at a high level of semiotic manipulation, right? Symbolic manipulation is his point. And he says, the people that do this best in culture today are DJs, web surfers, and artists. He claims artists have this kind of role too, that they're very good at doing this. So what does the semionaut do? Well, when they use a search engine in pursuit of a name or a subject, there's obviously going to be a massive information which is issued from data banks, which appear on the screen. The semionaut will then imagine the links, the likely relations between disparate sites and samples, and then he or she will sample those particular codes. And they're always doing this. They're always looking at these disparate sites, and they're putting things together. And as on a web, on the World Wide Web, it does not normally work in a linear way. There's stuff like hypertext where you can actually, work vertically through to get to different sources of information. And that is, of course, going to develop a different kind of literacy as well. A different kind of cognition too, I would argue, as well occurs if you're dealing with your major, literacy and communicative forms with something like digital media. So he's saying, the artist too is doing that, and Buriot says that this makes the artist a semionaut. It's always too, and it's also always within a network of signs. And, they're picked up and they're put somewhere else. Now, another good example of that is Christian Marclay's work. This one was called Crossfire. And what you had all these different shots of guys firing a gun. And you would have, one would call those cliches or tropes or formulas. So Mark Clay has sort of selected those from the archive of cinematic images of using guns. And, he's got people firing guns, unsheathing guns, letting off a burst and then stopping to, reload. And shootouts, sort of a climactic shootout at the end. And all these are mixed together. And really what he's doing in a way is first of all, it's a work about the spectacle of violence in Hollywood cinema, right? That's one of the topics. The other thing, of course, is the idea of ideas about weaponry and power. Also the sexualised power of firing guns and stuff like that, which is often put together. And so he's remixed, he's taken a pre-existing set of images or tropes and he's recontextualised them in order to make new meaning from this found footage. And by doing so, he draws our attention to cultural networks of meaning from which these kinds of ideas originate. As I said, Hollywood formulas for violent films and cultural ideas about guns and power, etc. And so again, as I said before, the topic is not really always immediately apparent with this kind of work. Now I just want to talk a little bit more now about social media. There is no doubt that social media has gained... There's no doubt that social media has gained enormous significance during the 21st century, and some claim that it is almost as popular as the internet itself, and further that it has revolutionised interpersonal and collective communication on an unprecedented scale. Now, for definitions, I think essentially social media is a product of Web 2 technology, and it's an advanced internet technology that has enabled applications such as blogs, wikis, and social bookmarking. Some of them are known, many of you will know them better than me: Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, LinkedIn, Wikipedia, YouTube, Vidler, Flickr, MySpace, these kinds of things. And what they do, they significantly expand access to and facilitate content and social exchange for a user-generated online culture, which, and this is important to note, invites collaboration and participation without requiring programming skills. And I think this is really important because I think what we have here is the notion of the creative amateur. The idea of the amateur in our culture, in a democratic culture, is more and more important. That is, that old notions of specialisation, and I think particularly in culture, I think it's yet to kind of reach finance in many ways, but certainly in culture, there's the idea that what these technologies are doing is they're really eradicating the need for specialisation. And with specialisation, I suppose, comes authority as a cultural producer. What you have in digital networks is the idea that anybody can produce. Just as anybody can go on the show World's Biggest Loser, they just have to be overweight. They need no other skill other than just being overweight to become a TV celebrity, if they're lucky, which their agent is telling them it's their big break, that they can do this. It's the same, it's the same sort of argument which is happening in the creation of cultural forms in the kind of digital, in the social media realm. And the other thing about it too is it's very interesting, and I'm sure there's items in news all the time, is the idea that what social media can tend to do is integrate the real and the virtual. It's the idea, and that gets back to the title of this lecture in many ways, the idea of the media sphere. Most people existing increasingly in a media sphere, and this media sphere is a kind of interesting mix between the real and the virtual. And as one theorist said, a guy called Geert Lovink, the goal is a synergy of the real existing social life with the annotated environment. Hence Second Life, and I'll look at it at Cal Fay's work on Second Life a bit later in this lecture. I just thought another interesting example of what I would call a virtual participatory culture is this guy, Rafael Lozano Hema. And what he's done, he's a Mexican-Canadian artist, and he does a lot of large-scale light shows. And this one was in the Zocalo Square in Mexico City. and I suppose gives you, I think I've shown this because it gives us a good example of virtual participation. What does that mean? Well, what he had, as you can see here, he had 18 powerful supercomputerised spotlights that lit up the sky in a dazzling display. And all of this was linked to an application on the internet through which people from all around the world could submit their designs for display. So the artwork was completed by public interaction via the web and could be seen from a radius of about 15 kilometres. And apparently 800,000 people from 89 countries in the world participated in making this project a success. So what we have is work which is populist, participatory and democratic, but it's kind of enabled through a virtual participation in the media sphere. This is very important. And for Hema, he calls these things anti-monuments. He says, look, the monument represents power. Like you'll have a monument of some king, which I noticed driving here this morning. There's that statue of King George V, of all people, in front of the town hall there. I find that a very unusual thing to have there. But he's there because he was a king and because he represented a certain authority. So that's a different kind of monument. Lozano, Hemmer's going, no, I want anti-monuments. I don't want something about rich people. I want something that everybody can kind of participate in, something which is anti-elite and is an alternative to a kind of fetishisation of power. So instead what you have is, he uses works like this to exploit those media sphere networks and relationships in order to produce what he would call a more democratic, participatory kind of work. But of course we also know kind of virtual participation through things like microblogging in platforms like Tumblr. And, as I said right at the start of this idea on social media, that these are becoming incredibly popular. Apparently in 2007 there were 110,000 users of Tumblr. Last year it was 6 million, which is a phenomenal sort of growth rate for these sorts of things. Now, why are they so popular? Well, because you can, and many of you I'm sure do this. I don't, but I'm sure many of you do. Users can just post anything from text blurbs, links, pictures, quotes, audio and video quickly and easily. You can just post them onto that site. You can do it from mobile phones. You can do it via instant messaging, and you can publish stuff off it in your own domain or subdomain. So the users and bloggers, like those artists I was talking about earlier, they act like picture editors as well. And they place images, text, etc. online. They can point other users to interesting resources with helpful commentary. So it's a fantastic sort of venue for information exchange. And it's been argued that this site's rapid exchange of images and the repurposing and transformation of content generate new systems of logic through interaction with other users. So, first of all, as I've already been spoken about, you've got the idea that you're editing. You're putting material on there that everyone is editing in their own way all the time. So it's a constantly evolving archive, it's always being changed or altered in some sort of way. And that in itself, the process in which you do that becomes a normal kind of cognition, a normal kind of way of putting together cultural information. And what another digital media theorist, Anne Friedberg, has called a participation through the mobilized virtual gaze, which is explained as not a direct perception, but a received perception, mediated through representation. In other words, this is changing the nature of visual culture itself, because it is generating new forms of cognition, as I said, in relation to the management of information, about the skills the brain is acquiring to manage this information. This so-called cut, copy, paste, remixing kind of sensibility, it's all a part of that. Now, as we know, and as I've said, there's been a massive growth in social media, and it's been supported by art museums. The Guggenheim, for instance, had this site called YouTube Play, and it was a highly successful show, really, in effect. It was kind of like a virtual exhibition. And they used social media on the internet, and in which the Guggenheim invited media artists from all over the world to submit work to YouTube with an accompanying blog called The Take. So, you know, anyone around the world could submit their own work to the Guggenheim space, as well as discussing these things. And then the Guggenheim selected the best 25 that were submitted, and then had an opening. It was obviously a kind of virtual. Well, they had an opening in the Guggenheim itself in New York, but that was streamed live on YouTube so that everyone could access it and have a look. Whitney Museum in New York's done similar thing, and London too, the Tate in London. Many museums are doing this. And in the case of the Whitney, they've exhibited a lot of net art in important survey shows too. The Whitney has a biennial called the Whitney Biennial, and it usually has the best of emerging American artists in it, and they've increasingly used net art and social media art in their kind of exhibitions. Now then I wanted to move to this guy who's really getting a lot of attention, and he's up on level 3, Ryan Tricarden. And this work called A Family Finds Entertainment. I think this is really important work for the discussion at hand today. As I said, he's received a lot of attention because he has a very intimate understanding of social networks in relation to digital devices, and I think in relation to what I've been talking about certain forms of cognition, and I think about certain forms of consciousness that comes from using social media. What he does too is he kind of satirises it. He plays a lot of these figures. You know, he plays both male and female roles. And you can see almost as a clown-like, almost hysterical kind of playing out of social media interaction. And he, in some ways, critiques what kind of sociality and what kind of personality is produced by social media. And I mean, I'm generalising there, which clearly not everyone responds in the hysterical way that Ryan Tricarden is presenting there. But he's also, by working in this way or showing this stuff, he's showing the way in which social media become an extension of our own bodies and provide shared experiences and a sense of virtual community, as I was sort of mentioning before. Now the other interesting thing is he posts a lot of his work on YouTube, and he posts it under a pseudonym called Wian Triton, which is a anagram, obviously, of his name. And so he's showing work on a social media platform in dialogue with the generation that he is from and that he's involved in. So he's immersed in this process of communicating. Now the story, there is a story to this, and loosely it's him. He plays an unstable homosexual who comes out to his parents. It's obviously dramatic. He then gets hit by a car, which is also dramatic. He's then reborn as the life of a party in his New Orleans home, just prior to that city being swept away by Hurricane Katrina. So you can't say it isn't a lively, kind of animated story that he presents there. And it's very interesting in one way because of the aesthetics as well. I mentioned that earlier. He uses the kind of what's described as a gaudy palette of things like YouTube, lo-fi graphics and digital effects, very agitated and erratic kind of camera work, rapid fire editing as well. So it's almost as if he's, it's hard, he's almost representing the formats of communication. You know, what are the formats, the forms of the way in which this communication looks and the way in which it's displayed, you know, i.e. rapid fire editing. Everything is done pretty quickly. Now, this suggests that he is highlighting a generation that is habituated to speed and brevity. You know, again, to oversimplify and stereotype the idea of, you know, a generation that does, or parts of a generation that does think something's wrong if you can't push a button in order to get that thing to work. You know, that if it doesn't work like that, then they can be thrown into confusion about what they are to do after that. So I think there's that sort of idea that's in here. And it's a kind of lingua franca, you know, the idea of a shared language like English is what he's sort of saying too, that Facebook and Twitter and these sorts of things have particular ways of communicating that use language in particular ways, you know, that has its own kind of conventions about communicating. So he's working out those sorts of things as well, often in a very hectic and disorienting way in his particular videos. And so it's also, it's also been talked about, discussed by critics, the way in which he presents the social media generation as having access to the most communal, heterogeneous and democratic of social spaces, and that of the same generation that also has acquired an identity and subjectivity that is constructed through the idea of bricolage and customisation and heterogeneous sources, you know, that's used to kind of doing this and picking everything together and then, you know, sort of moving on with it. Not that, so, you know, it's sort of saying it's not a lot of that process of reflection and contemplation. They aren't particular qualities that you would necessarily associate with the kind of interactive and communicative forms of social media like this. Also, you know, critics have said it's a kind of about a fleeting kind of narcissism, a kind of shallow, hysterical and desensitised kind of, sort of consciousness, which also has slippery models of beauty, desire, gender and sexuality, because he's always shifting into different kind of gender roles and that at the same time. And that one critic has suggested that his approach, quote, owes less to the history of art than to a hyper-connected technological world in which everyone can be producer and consumer, celebrity and viewer all at once. So it's also the idea too that celebrity becomes an ideal form of consciousness which young people aspire to be and act like, you know, act out. Which I've seen firsthand but won't bore you with the reflections of an old man. Now, with something like, a lot of artists are dealing with this. A very good Brisbane artist, Grant Stevens, has worked with the kind of social media site in this way. It is a video work, unfortunately. I'm just showing you a still shot from it. As you can see, it's called In the Beyond. And what he did is he went to social networking sites like MySpace, and then he appropriated, again, a pre-existing database of knowledge, and he appropriated a lot of the statements that were made. Statements like, I'm a bit of a smart ass, I bite my nails, I'm grumpy in the mornings. Those kinds of very typical statements that are made on such sites, and then he, as you can see here, he set them up in concentric circles, has rainbow hues and a new age soundtrack he had as well to this particular work. So again, like Trecarton, Stevens is setting up a kind of a particular type of narrative. You know, what kind of world is the media sphere here? You know, what sort of world do these people inhabit that do write things on it like, I bite my nails, you know, like a sort of world in which is assumed that other people are interested in the fact that you bite your nails, for instance. And it's usually about ephemeral experiences, you know, quotidian confessions, fears, the need to communicate. You know, many people use these sites in order to express those things. Isn't there too that sort of recent idea that there's a kind of abusive tone which has entered into a lot of social media because of the anonymity, encourages people to say outrageous and prejudicial things because somehow they that freedom, that sort of encourages them to say, horrible things about other people. And so again, it's just an idea of, what sort of sensibility, I suppose. And it is, we can say that someone biting nails is a very mundane form of self-expression. People, of course, adopt online personas as well, as I sort of just mentioned. And he's also presenting a kind of mandala form. It's a perfect concentric form. So setting up the idea in which it becomes, and it's hypnotic because this slowly turns around as you're listening to the new age music. And I suppose he's kind of saying, a little bit about the hypnotic, dreamlike and comforting aspect of the social media world and the virtual participation that occurs within it. Now, just the last part of the lecture, I've got 5 minutes, just talk a little bit about art and gaming. Entertainment, as we know, is a major sector in the digital era. We're a society dedicated to mass forms of leisure, whether via tourism, celebrity public events, or forms of entertainment on the web. And this American artist, Corey Archangel, did a lot of work on this in it's almost a decade ago now, but he used to hack into old software games like Mario Brothers stuff, and then he'd actually work on the software of these games and remove certain things. So in this case, he removed all of the characters. And by doing so, I suppose he foregrounded how bland and decorative some of these things were. But also, a bit like Tricarton, he reveals the kind of, as I said, the visual regime, the style of digital illustration, of the digital image. What does it look like? Well, that's a graphic style is something, again, that we're going to focus on because we're not following Donkey Kong or whatever on the screen. We're actually looking at the backgrounds. Just two more artists. Cao Fei is a very big Chinese artist. She has also become fascinated with Second Life, and so she developed this city called R&B City, as you can see, and she, created all of these virtual characters. In fact, she, how people have avatars in Second Life, and I have heard of people, sort of falling in love with their avatar, with another avatar in Second Life, and then meeting up in real life to get married, even though they might not have actually met each other in real life. In this case, Cao Fei, that's her avatar, so it's obviously often for people it's an idealised view of themselves. It's again the idea of fantasy is very, very important in this case, and with her character of with a character she called China Tracy, as you can see here, that China Tracy leads her newborn son. She has a son through this city, and this woman is clad in metal sort of armour, and is an inventor, architect, builder, and also a very powerful destructive force. And so she's tapping into that idea with works like that and the previous one, into the idea of immersion, the way in which the digital world and things like Second Life offer you a very seductive form of experience. And finally, another Brisbane artist, Chris Howlett, has what he has done is he's worked with some of these platforms like Forterra systems, Sims Online, and as I said, with Cao Fei, the avatar system. And he works on them in a very kind of subversive way. What he does is, apparently with Sims, he informs me, these are live simulation computer games. It's people love hacking these games. Here you create your own community, and you have babies and all of that sort of stuff. That's so popular to hack Sims programs that some companies that produce Sims software produce some of it so that it can be hacked. So so popular is that. And he also hacks, but what he does is in this home, when you're supposed to build a community, he hacks into it and turns it into sort of chaos. So he plays around with this. This is another work called Bushstalker, where he linked the idea of that hunting game at night with experiences of US soldiers in the Iraqi war that were coming back. You could hear it on headphones when you were playing the game of shoot and kill, that you could hear these ideas of the American coming back to Americans saying, oh, it's really strange, it's really unreal over in Iraq because you're supposed to kill people over there, but you come back to America and to kill people's the wrong thing to do. So he's also trying to highlight that kind of interesting relationship between the real and fantasy, which things like these games present. So anyway, in conclusion, I hope you've enjoyed this clearly. And also I want to thank you all for attending today, and especially those people who have attended all of the lectures. And I just want you to know that what I have looked at during these series, in case you don't know, is I looked at first in the first lecture the artist's relationship to history. Second lecture I looked at the idea of globalisation and the way many of the artists in this show have responded to that. Last week I looked at the idea of physical participation in art with things like The Slide by Carsten Heller and works like that. And as you know, today I've talked about the sphere of virtual participation. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to everybody for coming along today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the Talking About Contemporary Art series continues until Saturday the 2nd of April. Next week, Mark will be joined by Julie Ewington, Curatorial Manager of Australian Art here at the Gallery, to discuss contemporary Australian art within an international context. So we hope to see you then, and please join me again in thanking Mark for today's lecture.